Hello and welcome back to the Double Loop Podcast, your source for everything about fingerprints. While you're doing your comparisons, we'll talk about comparisons. This is going to be episode 14, and welcome back to the family of fantastic Floridians fiddling with physical developer. I'm Eric Ray.
I'm Glenn Langenberg.
You got to come up with one of these weeks, Glenn. I'm running out of ideas.
Okay, I'll work on an amazing alliteration for all.
For all, thank you. All right. So we got Thanksgiving coming up this week. Any big plans up in Minnesota? Is it already freezing cold?
Yeah, we are below zero wind chill. It is definitely cold. Switzerland, because I was in Switzerland last week and I'm back now. It's cold there, but it's manageable cold. It's in the 30s, 40s, and so forth. But this is just bitter North Canada cold here in Minnesota.
We've had our own little cold front down in Arizona. It rained for 2 days, and highs only got up into the 60s. So it was
hilarious. Everyone had on their down parkas.
Yeah, pretty much. It was actually really nice just having basically 48 straight hours of rain. About 2 or 3 inches, which is crazy amount of rain for this part of the country.
And for our international listeners, what is 60 degrees Fahrenheit?
You're gonna make me do the conversions right off the top of my head.
What is it, like 20 Celsius or something?
Oh, that sounds about right.
18 Celsius.
Yeah.
And here
we're at teens.
Yeah, I think we're around minus 10 to minus 12 Celsius.
Well, don't forget that this is where it's starting to get nice here. Our record a few years back for Phoenix was 50 Celsius. So it's a little hot.
Wow, that's hot. All right. Well, besides the weather, Eric, how was your week?
It was good. Penny Deckens and I did our exclusion class online through RTI. And we had a great turnout and some great discussions on during the class. It's the first time I've been able to operate in that format. Have you ever done anything like that before?
No, I haven't. I have a bunch of questions for you. So, if you don't mind,
sure, go ahead.
So the format: are you live teaching and people have logged on and they're watching a live lecture?
Sort of. We're live teaching, but all the attendees are watching basically a PowerPoint presentation on their computer, and then listening to myself and Penny, give our little spiel and talk through each of the slides. So they don't see us, but we can show. And highlight different things on the screen and move through the slides, and we try to kind of pay attention to the text box, and that's how people can raise their hand or write in questions as we go. It took some getting used to, but I think it turned out really well.
Then I guess I have done something like that. RTI sponsored the trace evidence pattern evidence symposium down in Florida.
Yeah, that's right.
I guess, a year or two ago? You were at that.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago.
Yeah, and it was the same setup where you were giving a lecture, and they were running it online so that people could ask questions from a distance and follow the PowerPoint. Well, that sounds like a great format to reach a lot of viewers and students.
Yeah, and since it was free, that's what a lot of the feedback that we got was there were people from agencies that had heard about the class and had been wanting to take it or somehow get that information for a while now, but they couldn't make it to the IAI conference because their agency couldn't afford it or whatever. So this was kind of their chance to listen in, and then so then after a few weeks, RTI is going to get it all edited down and make it available online on demand, so people can go back and then still get that information if they missed the chance to see it all live.
Well, let me ask you this. Just I'm thinking, putting my business, cap on. Does that cut into things at all? Now that that's sort of available online, are you worried that you won't be able to present in different venues or have as many students come to the workshops because they can just get it for free online?
Yeah, well, this version of what we're teaching is really it's kind of Penny and I with our DPS hats on saying this is what we faced at DPS and this is how we addressed these issues with policy changes at DPS. And we've always done it for free at conferences or for agencies that have brought us out. Our new class that we are calling exclusionology, that's when we're putting on more of our private hats and taking a deeper look at that exclusion issue at each stage of the ACE-V and what standards mean and what sufficiency means, what specificity means, looking at exclusion instead of identification. It's just going to more of an in-depth thing. What we've put online so far is just a real basic thing, and just from this other perspective of how we've handled it so far at our agency, as opposed to looking in more of the how do you exclude instead of what policies should you set up about exclusion. That's what our new class is more focused on.
I see. Okay, so you're just giving them a little taste to get them hooked, but not necessarily giving away the heroin cow.
Well, we put out there what we've done so far, and now we're looking for the next step.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, I guess that makes a lot of sense. And you got good feedback from the students?
Yeah, it was funny. We typically, it's a little story that goes along with it. Typically, when we do this class, we mention one of our DNA analysts named DeVere, who has 10 arches. And so that goes really into the topic of value for exclusion only and what is of value and how much do you need before you can at least exclude DeVere. Well, DeVere used to work in Illinois State Lab, so she had former coworkers in different places around the country listening, and they all started sending her text messages saying, "Hey, we just heard your name in this class," and so even from those channels, we got some pretty good feedback. It was great to hear all that.
That's funny. So DeVere is the poster child, as opposed to talking about quote-unquote the suspect with all whorls and you have an arch. DeVere is our poster child suspect for exclusion cases.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Well, one of the cool things we got to do is we got lots of data out of this because we had over 200 people in the room, and we gave everybody 10 comparison examples to work through, and some of them were close non-matches, some of them were just exclusions, some of them were IDs that looked like the pattern was different. There was just a mix, and it was just interesting to see all the data come in total, but hidden from the participants, we could watch the data as it rolled in, and a lot of these prints where the pattern was different, you'd have this instant spike in exclusions where you'd have 40 people or 20 people or within the first 10 seconds just click exclusion because the pattern was different. And then as time went on, the people that took more time to look at the comparison were all coming to identification decisions. So that was also really cool to see.
How did you administer these? Were these side-by-sides on screen, or were materials that they downloaded ahead of time?
They were side-by-side on screen, so everyone saw it instantly all at the same time. Now, some of the images have been available on CLPEX in the fingerprint interest group for quite a while, but this is just kind of what we saw as the data was rolling in.
Yeah, okay. Well, you'd imagine that people taking an exclusion class might have slowed down a little bit to see if there were any funny, you shouldn't maybe exclude on this type of pattern example.
Well, yeah, but that's kind of generally what we saw is the ones that were a little too quick with their snap judgment of calling that exclusion. All of a sudden you'd see a whole lot of exclusions on a comparison when we knew in some cases ground truth that it was an ID, but as time went by, and the people that spent the most time on it were generally coming to the correct determination.
Imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Okay.
you had a chance to sit down with Nicole Egli. Am I close on that last name?
Yeah, Egli,
Okay.
Egli, Egli.
And we're gonna play that interview here next, and then talk for a little bit about it. So let's cut away to that.
All right, so I'm here in Switzerland at the home of Nicole Egli, and that's not your last name though. Your last name has changed. What
Yes,
is it now?
it's Nicole Egli Antonios.
Right, and Nicole was a student at the University of Lausanne, but now you are a
Assistant lecturer.
assistant lecturer at the University of Lausanne, and you did a PhD on the topic of fingerprints at the University of Lausanne. Please tell us the title and a little bit about your PhD.
Oh, the title, it was a long title. It's Interpreting Partial Fingerprints Using AFIS Scores.
Something along
Close
those
enough,
lines.
yes.
Close enough.
Yes.
Okay, and what was the topic of it?
It was about computing likelihood ratios for fingerprint to finger mark comparisons using AFIS scores as an overall measure of the whole comparison.
Hmm. And how would one go about generating likelihood ratios using AFIS scores?
One would get into a really good relationship with their AFIS vendor as a first step, and you need two things. You need a description of the within finger variability through the scores of the AFIS, and a description of the between source scores of variability. So you would need to be able to extract all of the scores compared to your overall database, or at least a large number of those scores of your database. So, and that's where your good relationship with your AFIS vendor comes in. So you can automatically do that kind of thing.
Right. So the first thing was within variability. So you would want to run lots of images from the same individual and see what types of scores come back.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
You take several marks, several prints. It kind of depends on the approach you're using, but you would need marks and prints from the same individual,
Yeah.
or pseudo marks. So if you can find a good replacement of marks, and that was a part of my PhD as well, was to see whether marks where you ask the individual to put their finger down several times, and then you go and use your detection method and see whether the group of minutiae you're interested in is present on those marks or not, to replace that by something simpler.
Right. So normally when you're running lots of prints from the same person, you'd expect fairly high AFIS scores.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yes, depends on the number of minutiae you put in, but yes, you would expect high scores in
Yeah.
that case, yeah.
Would you expect a wide range of variation? Does the distortion affect the scores that much that the scores can vary wildly, or does it depend on the AFIS matcher, or do they tend to be a little bit in a more narrow variability?
I can only talk about the matcha I have seen, and there was a wide variability. There was a very wide variability for scores when comparing the same source. The variability was actually much smaller when comparing things from different sources. It seemed to express something along the lines of, that's just not it, the between scores, whereas the within scores showed a lot of variation.
All right. So the way I hear that is that distortion can have a huge impact on, of course, the appearance of a mark, a latent print, quote unquote, against a control print.
Yes.
So, all right. So distortion is a huge factor and can change the variation in appearance significantly, but when compared to the scores from different people,
They're higher.
yeah.
In general, they are higher. Some of the scores through this distortion can be of the same kind of magnitude as the scores from different persons when compared to different persons, but overall they will be higher. And if you have the more minutiae you have, the more higher they will be.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So now when comparing against different scores, different people, and did you ever have the opportunity to see really large, high scores from
two different sources. In other words, I'd expect close non-matches.
No.
No, okay.
No, not at all. And we did use a database with a little less than 100,000 people, 96,000 different handprint cards.
So that's 1 million fingerprints?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we actually had a student of ours had a project searching for close non-matches, and it was a very nice research project, but she didn't find any.
She didn't find any?
No,
That's
nothing nice visually where we could say, oh yeah, this is a good approach to systematically go and search for close non-matches.
Again, do you think it's an issue of the size of the database, or is it the selection of the features that were used? Because there are obviously some clusters of minutia that you'd expect to have lower specificity and so could be shared by more people.
A bit of both, I think. And also about the stringency of what we were looking for, that was really well defined, what we would think would be a close non-match.
Okay. So once you have this set of scores you generate a set of scores from the same person or people, and then you generate another set of scores from different people, and that gives you your two distributions.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
And then does this now become sort of the basis, the model for a score in a case where you don't know if it's from that person or from two different people?
Yes, we will compare that scores to those two distributions and see under which distributions we more expect to see that kind of score, that magnitude of a score.
Yeah, okay. Now, I think some listeners will probably go, well, I see lots of really high scores that aren't from this person at all. I don't know what AFIS is looking at, or I don't trust these AFIS scores. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I did use clearly visible minutiae in my research. So the AFIS scores are based on minutiae that are actually present on the print. Mm-hmm. And minutiae that are absent from the print but present on the mark are generally viewed as something rather costly. That is not expected overall. So that's one thing, is that I used very well visible minutiae. The other advantage of this is that they are properly placed, they are nicely orientated, they are good minutiae. So a part of what we would put into distortion is not really present because I wasn't guessing about the exact spot of my minutiae. It was there. Otherwise, I think that in particular AFIS systems are probably the best measure of similarity we have at this point in time. Mm-hmm. So if we want an objective measure of similarity, I really think they are the closest we can get at this point in time. Sure. These scores have been worked on for a very long time, and I think they are a good measure distinguishing similar from different things.
Have you looked at multiple AFIS vendors to get a sense of how scores are generated, or just one?
Not at all, only one.
Yeah. I think sometimes too that some of these scores, I think some listeners will go, well, I've seen really high scores and they're not from the same person. But I mean, isn't it true that AFIS doesn't basically take into account some of the differences? To an examiner's eye, you'll see a minutia in between matching minutia and immediately go, okay, it cannot be him. But AFIS doesn't necessarily take that into account in the same way that the human does.
No, not in the same way. And I always consider that any type of likelihood ratio calculation, as I understand it, it comes in the evaluation phase. The person has carried out an analysis, has carried out a comparison, and evaluates using a tool, an accessory tool to what the person has already seen. So
it's not replacing their decision, it's complementing it.
No, it's complementing it. It will help probably for some of the close non-matches when we estimate distances, perhaps less well than some Cartesian system. But it might. I'm not at all sure about this. I haven't tested this. But it would not help typically for the big differences that you can see immediately. That's not the context in which I think a model should be used.
Yeah, okay. right now, what do you think are some of the steps that are preventing us to move forward using this type of approach?
I think they're not overly accessible at this point in time.
The scores.
The scores and overall the models that have been carried out, that have been established.
The vendors are protective of their...
No. It's more a question of that there's not... everybody doesn't necessarily have to establish a new model, so they don't necessarily have one. Because you would need to go through testing, using a certain data set to see how you model these distributions, how you get to your scores, how you do things. So you'd have to establish it in your place with your system yourself, basically. Depending on what is demanded, validate it.
And part of that is because everybody's database is different from everyone else's, so you can't just use standard scores. Your scores will be generated from the specific database that you have access to.
I think I would phrase it a bit differently.
Sure.
In my thesis, I actually tested database dependence. That
Oh.
was a large part of it, or database dependence in the sense of how many scores do I need to extract from the between finger database in order to be reasonably sure that my distribution is going to stay stable. And at that point, if my distribution stays stable, for me it was 10,000 with my system. And then if I used 10,000 prints and I chose another 10,000 prints, well, the distributions were overall the same, but meaningfully the same.
Yeah.
So it's not a database question. However, it will be a question of how your system is behaving with respect to that.
Okay.
Whether you need 10,000, 6,000,
Yeah. Okay.
20,000, whether you can model it using a parametric distribution, which was my case, or whether you have to use a non-parametric distribution, or how your scores look overall when you do these different comparisons.
Okay, so that's the validation aspect that you're talking about, that you can't just start doing this. You have to have some underlying data to demonstrate the stability and the ruggedness of your results. And
to know how to use those scores to actually get a value of probability for your evidence score.
Right, but at the end of the day, what I'm hearing you say is that if anyone wants their own statistical model, if they have access to an AFIS, they technically have one that they could convert if they wanted to go through those steps.
They could if they had a really good relationship with their AFIS vendor, because the easiest way of doing this is not copying your scores down, and usually they are inside the system, so you need to be able to automatically extract a set of scores that you told the system which scores you want.
Yeah, okay.
Depending on finger number, general pattern, things like that. So it's really easy once you have the access you need.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. All right, so can I ask you what projects you're working on right now? What can we expect in the near future from you?
I'm using the model, which was a very theoretical model, and my thesis didn't work on a whole lot of fingers. Really, there were 2. And so I'm validating the model and testing it against real casework data.
Oh, fantastic.
And one of the first problems we encountered was that I had a model that worked from 6 to 12 minutiae, 6 to 10, sorry. And the first thing that happened was that the casework that I worked on had actually a lot more minutiae. And so I had to upgrade the model quite a lot with respect to that, because that was not really very nice to have to exclude the high value cases.
Any sense of percentage of marks that were higher than 12, or do you know that offhand?
They were not randomly chosen.
Yeah. Okay.
So they actually, what I got in the beginning were easy marks, so we could see how they would behave against the easy marks. But I, with respect to what I'd always been told about casework marks, I was actually surprised at the quality that was still present in those marks. I
don't know if you had seen this paper that Cedric and I published when they came, FSS, when Cedric Newman was working there. they brought that model to work on our casework, and so they just randomly took cases, and they found on average most of the marks couldn't be run through their model since it ended at 12. So they found on average our marks had 17 minutia, and that's just case, nothing special. And we do take complex cases. It's not that we just select only the good ones. It just seems that a lot of the casework marks are not as complex as I think people either might think or critics might lead us to believe.
Perhaps also just a question of how much time you spend on things.
Yeah, that's possible too. Although again, in the study, they pulled tons of marks that we did not keep or feel that were worth comparison, and did further tests on them and didn't find a lot of value in those.
I remember that study, yeah.
So I'm just kind of curious if you were seeing the same thing in some of the casework marks that you were seeing here in Switzerland.
Not really. It's not with the Swiss organization. It's not Swiss marks.
Oh, sorry.
It's from an international organization.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
What I think I can say is that at this point I'm working on close non-matches that have come up through casework. So we'll see how that goes, because that's going to be really interesting to see how the model reacts to those close non-matches, whether it can actually really help us a lot in that respect or not.
Yeah. My understanding too with close non-matches in the model is that always comes down to your distortion element. That if the model is too strict with distortion, then of course it will detect the close non-matches, but then generally your likelihood ratio scores tend to be smaller. And then on the other hand, if you allow for more tolerance in the distortion aspect, then it doesn't detect the close non-matches, but then you've got these very large likelihood ratios. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Could be. Now, it also depends on how you use the model. You don't necessarily always have to use it in a single and only purpose. So we have some ideas about that.
Okay. All right. Any other research on the front that you can talk about?
Other research.
Do you do any detection techniques or things like that?
I don't. No. I'm not at all. I teach detection with the students. I'm not in the research on progressing on detection techniques formally.
Okay. Well, then I guess my last question for you is, if you had a giant pot of money and a magic wand, what would you change about forensic science right now? What do you think forensic science would benefit from a fairy godmother? Waves her wand and says, poof, I'm going to change this.
I think two things.
Okay.
I think buy people some time to get proper training in some respects, and the time to handle casework properly, to discuss if it's necessary with the detectives about what exactly the information is that they want, so we actually answer the questions that we should be answering and that we have the time. From what I hear is sometimes somewhat of a problem to carry out the work in the way that we would like to and should be doing it.
So if I heard you correctly, you get a sense that sometimes we work more like a factory. We're just pumping out cases and not really thinking about the relevance of the information, if it's helpful or not. We're just sending out reports and hoping that we've answered the questions without necessarily good communication of what the relevant questions are. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that sometimes there's just not enough time to concentrate really on the case at hand and how it is exactly situation, and that it's not just a finger mark. Often it's not just a finger mark.
Yeah. I find in the States that there is this sort of pressure to just push out reports and not worry about those things. That essentially that's not our duty anymore, that our duty is to just answer the questions, him or it's not, and you don't need any case information, you don't need to know this or that about, just answer the question. And of course that's coming from critics, it's coming, it's throughout the National Academy of Science report, that this is just leading to too many issues of bias. But the general philosophy here seems to be that it's important to actually understand the relevance of this information. Is that?
Yeah, the relevance of the question and how we could be helpful perhaps differently than the first question that is asked in some instances.
Okay.
Doesn't mean we'll not identify the finger marks any longer, but it means that maybe we could decide with the person which finger marks are more important, whether we have to decide on suitability issues together rather than just decide on suitability based on the mark, whether there are issues that could be resolved in kind of a larger picture than just here's the mark, compare it to this person.
And also along the lines of what you just said, I mean, I take it you would be in favor of doing away from, or moving away from identified or excluded in these more definitive terms, and being able to provide some scale of support, which would allow us to offer information, under conditions of, less than quote unquote absolute certainty.
I absolutely am.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure that our absolute certainty is all that useful, because people can handle probabilistic expressions in a general way. They are well understood, if they are well communicated, of course, but they are used in several different contexts, and there's really no absolute need for them.
Yeah. Okay. And you feel investigators could handle that type of information on different levels, that this is strongly suggesting that this person is the source versus we have some limited information suggesting this person is the source, continue investigation to find other evidence.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I think so. But I also think that we will need a structure around this that would operationally solve certain problems that could at the first level arise, because if you don't identify, there's no reason to not compare the mark at the first sight. But you can still have rules in place that tell you at what point you will stop comparing a mark to everybody in the world.
Okay. No. Well, anything else you'd like to say to the listeners?
No, thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this afternoon. We had a lovely lunch. You prepared a soup and some bread and a nice plate of cheeses. And of course wine. Of course. Salty. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
And we're back. All right, Glenn, thank you very much for taking the time to sit down with Nicole. That was a very interesting interview.
Yeah, it was certainly my pleasure. It was a very nice, relaxed afternoon there in Lausanne. And Nicole, had done all this work for her PhD that she talked about. And I've always been sort of fascinated with the concept of using AFIS as a model for likelihood ratio, since these vendors are essentially trying to some way measure the strength of quote unquote a match, and this doesn't necessarily take into account different features or they have their own, obviously their proprietary weighting mechanisms for weighting those in agreement and those out of agreement, but at the end of the day, it's some kind of measurement for a match. And Nicole was trying to, essentially take advantage of that by, using a score-based approach to, the statistic. And all that really is, there's a lot of complicated stuff in that interview, but at the end of the day, it really is just trying to, in some way, capture how strong, how good of a match is this on some kind of scale.
Right, and I mean, obviously, just the number that comes back from the AFIS matchers gives you some idea of how well things match up.
Right.
But this goes a step further and kind of places this likelihood ratio of whether or not this high score is because it's actually the guy, or just because it happens to look like the guy. Whether or not the differences, because there's always differences, are because of distortion or because it's just different.
Yeah, I mean, and as she was talking about, the important thing is to have two distributions. It's just like in any hypothesis testing, you're considering two hypotheses. You're looking at the probability of seeing this high score if they are from the same source versus the probability of seeing this high score if they were from two different people. And that's all this likely ratio calculation is that those two probabilities. But as she was saying, you have to have the underlying data, the two distributions. In any of your statistics classes, it's like considering the probability of some test result if the person has cancer versus the exact same test result if they don't have cancer.
Where I first thought that things were going was that, say you got these two distributions, that you would basically slide over to whatever score you got in a specific case, and then you'd be able to see going up from that specific score where that score falls on the distribution ratio of match versus no match, and then generate from there. But from what she was saying, it's a little more complex than that. You'd have to, for each individual, generate, or each comparison, generate these distributions. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I started to get lost a little bit myself, but the way I understood is that you first have to build these underlying distributions for generally what happened, the range of distortion you expect from a single person. So you take lots and lots of examples, but I don't know for a single case if you necessarily have to build a distribution around that single case. I don't. Maybe I'm missing something from the interview, but I don't recall having that. You'd have to essentially test each latent print and build a distribution around that. Do you recall something specific on that?
It was more that getting the multiple copies of an individual's print under different distortions. Do you remember that part? Yes.
Yes. Okay. So right, that is building that, looking at that range of variability. I think to set it up in the first place, you have to have that distribution for the people in your database. You have to have that multiple inkings from essentially the same person. Although, again, in a specific case, I don't know that you need multiple inkings, but I suppose more data would be helpful.
Oh, okay. One database that most of us have access to is the FBI's database. But it sounds like from what Nicole was saying is that we needed a static database that just stayed with the same number of people and didn't change. Is that right?
Well, no, I'm not sure I got that from it. I think the main thing she was saying is you need a relationship with your AFIS vendor so that they can dump the data to you, and again, you would have a range of distribution scores for your data set. That doesn't mean you can't add more people in and out of the database. It just means at some point you need to take a snapshot of the performance of the system. You need to know what scores are typical for when they are all coming from the same person versus when they're coming from different people. And for those that know the 50K versus 50K study, and they attempted to do half of this problem. They did the problem of, well, how different are scores when they're coming from different people? They never did the other half of this problem, essentially running multiple inked prints from the same person to get scores when they are coming from the same person. In fact, in the 50K versus 50K study, when they had a couple of print cards from the same person, they actually did have high scores, and they treated them as outliers and took them out of the data, when in fact that should have actually led them towards a different approach. So, I mean, it's not that you can't have it's not that you have to have a static database. You have to have enough data to generate these two distribution curves and to know the performance of your AFIS. And you'll never get that from IAFIS. We won't ever have that kind of access to IAFIS.
Well, you don't think that's something that the folks at Noblesse or that are working on improving IAFIS, that's not a feature coming down the line at some point?
Oh, I'm sure that's something that they may have access to. That's not something we will ever have access to.
Right. No, but I'm saying is a feature within the ULW software that would generate this type of number that they would set up and build in as a kind of a feature of the system.
That is an interesting proposal. I'd love to know if anyone from Noblest is listening to include something like that. I think that would be wonderful if they included essentially a likelihood ratio tool generated from AFIS data. That would be a fantastic value-added feature. I don't know that anyone necessarily would start going out and use it right away, but you might end up with some, budding researchers who decide that they want to start using it in their casework and maybe start collecting data on cases. That would be fantastic.
Well, we can hope or dream or cower in fear or whatever your response is to that idea, but that might be something that happens. Who knows?
Well, I think it would be nice to have a likelihood ratio tool, a statistic that if someone wanted to go ahead and validate in their laboratory, they could start working that, from that, a common tool that we could all use. And I think, Eric, that's a great idea, is to start with AFIS.
I mean, it's the most universal thing that we have, at least in the States, obviously, is what I'm talking about, that is available to almost every fingerprint examiner out there, and I don't know, gets around some of the proprietary issues that come up with this topic.
Sure, I agree.
So, Glenn, towards the end, Nicole was talking about kind of things that she would like to see if she had the magic wand to make things happen, and one of them was this whole idea of a verbal scale to describe conclusions instead of our current setup of ID exclusion or inconclusive. And I know you've suggested this multiple times. Now, are you leaning towards just a strict verbal scale of having to do with support, or do you see the identification term for some of these just crazy 20 plus point IDs, and then as it goes down from there, switching over at some point to a verbal scale? Where do you fall in all that?
Okay, all right. Well, let's back up a little bit and clarify what we're talking about here. Right. What Nicole is referring to is something that Ian Ebbett and others, have proposed for many, many years, is that we treat, this forensic approach as hypothesis testing. You consider the evidence under two competing propositions or multiple propositions. And for us, of course, that the source of the mark, the finger, the latent fingerprint is either this person or somebody else, and we gather evidence to support one of those two hypotheses. And instead of reporting identified or excluded or inconclusive, you would report some kind of gradation, a qualified opinion that it either weakly supports, moderately supports, strongly supports, or maybe even extremely strongly supports the proposition that they are from the same source or from different sources. And so in that verbal scale, there is no identification, there's no exclusion, there's simply extreme strong support for the proposition they're from the same source. So you never say the word, I identified it. All right, so that's what she's talking about. That's how she would see this. You asked my personal opinion. My personal opinion is I would like to have a verbal scale. However, I also can't completely remove myself from my brainwashing and my environment, and I feel like identified is a very useful term when you go to court to simplify things. It's helpful to tell the jury, I think, or judge, yeah, it's identified, and for all intents and purposes, it's from this person. I could live with both, to be frank. If someone came along and said, you know what, we're doing away with it, we're just going to, extremely strong support, and that is now the new identified, I can live with that. I know a lot of people would have difficulty, and honestly, I feel that is the biggest difficulty in moving away from traditional practices. I think that's the last thing that examiners would be willing to give up. I don't think examiners will want to give up that term. It's just too much at the heart of what it is to be a pattern evidence specialist. Identifications.
I agree. I think that is because I don't know. I think just doing the work on a daily basis exposes you to, I don't know, maybe changes your mind. Maybe you're right. Maybe it is a brainwashing term. That's the best way to put it.
Indoctrination.
And because it is so hard to describe what that means, of where you get to that point where you know it's an identification. But once you've been through the process of training and doing it for months and months and years, you understand. And I don't know if there's really any other way to get around to get to that level to that understanding that we all kind of share other than just doing the work for years.
Yeah, and also from a practical standpoint, I think there is a point where the information is just so overwhelming that even extremely strong support really doesn't do it justified. That what
Exactly.
you're really trying to say is that the chance that someone else could share these features is just so ridiculously small, it's really a non-issue. And for example, 10 prints. If you have all clear 10 fingers, it would seem silly to not have to, the ability to say identified,
Right.
and then have to say something like, well, this is extremely strong support. When
Right.
you're really trying to say it is him and it's essentially indisputable, it would be nice to have some. My instinct is I'd prefer to have this identified. I would just prefer to have the other thing too, and then have some way of assessing that when you have above this level, we can call this an identification. That anything above this, it's just really a non-issue. And maybe that's, like you said, 20, 30 minutia. Or 40 or 50, maybe we're saying that this is when you have nearly the entire fingerprint. Anything above that and beyond that, it's just a non-issue at that point.
Well, okay, so let's assume that we're 20 years in the future, and this is kind of the setup of where once you get past say 20, we do an ID. Maybe down to between 10 and 20 is extremely strong support, and then maybe below 10, if there's still enough, the things we would still ID now, that's strong support. And then we start describing some of these things that right now we're just saying inconclusive or no value, we're not comparing at all.
Right.
Would it be a matter of at this point then we'd just be comparing every little piece of friction-ridge detail?
No, I think the other thing that she said, she gave two things, if you recall. The other thing that she said goes hand in hand with this, is it's not just about giving conclusions, it's about the context of the case. You wouldn't compare just at anything. You would only compare those marginal marks in a case when it had real relevance. When that latent print actually would have an impact on that case to say, look, this person who is being strongly considered because of this other evidence, there is moderate support that he also touched this surface, and so you combine evidence. So it's not just about just going through the motions and just throwing out conclusions and comparing everything. It's about comparing the relevant evidence in a case, which, like she was saying, would involve us having a greater role in discussing with people, with investigations, trying to figure out what evidence is actually relevant in this case, and not just be technicians and monkeys that here are some lists, tell us something. That's not the Lausanne view, as we've heard in some previous episodes, and obviously Pierre was talking about a couple of episodes. It's really more about an interaction with investigations and scientists about what is a relevant bit of information.
Down the road in the future, I mean, I can totally see this, that we would have some setup where, for the most part, in the absolute day-to-day case and operation, examiners are working very much like they are now, coming to for the most part the same kinds of conclusions that they are now. But when it's appropriate, applying some type of likelihood ratio to either more accurately describe the identification or more accurately describe our inconclusive category, but not all the time. It's just in cases or in comparisons where that additional information is necessary and pertinent.
Yeah, that would seem to make the most sense.
Well, any other interesting stuff? I wish I could have been there for, for the interview. If nothing else, just to be in Switzerland.
Well, and as you know, as we had discussed, but if the listeners weren't always clear why, there's such a time difference between where you were and where I was that, you would have had to get up at, 4 or 5 in the morning on some of these, for a 20-minute interview. So it just made more sense. And by the way, I always didn't have internet access either, so it really would have been very difficult to set some of those up. So it was a shame you couldn't always be there for that. But thanks for...
Oh no! Thank you for grabbing those interviews while you had the chance. We'll definitely keep finding more and more interesting people to talk to.
Yeah, the one thing that disappoints me the most was I never had a chance to sit down with my mentor, Christophe Champeau. We had a lot of social things going on. He was very busy, and it just never really worked out for us to sit down. I didn't want to impose, but I'll make sure I get him next time I see him.
Oh, we'll definitely get him down for an interview at some point here.
And sorry, I was just going to say, I think this the qualified conclusions topic, that might have some legs. We may need to go into another episode and discuss that because I posted about it recently on the CLPEX board, and there was some discussion there, and I think that's worth coming back to. So maybe next episode we'll explore that a little further.
Sounds like a great plan. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of the Double Loop Podcast. Sounds like we got our topic all set for next week. If you want to join us for another episode then, as always, you can look for the Double Loop Podcast every Tuesday morning on iTunes or on Stitcher or on SoundCloud. SoundCloud is where it's probably easiest to make little comments about each episode. And you can send in comments to us, and we'll bring them up on the air. And you can send those to Glenn at eliteforensicservices.com, GLENN at ELITE forensicservices.com. Like I said, you write in, we'll get you on the air, we'll read your question or talk to you in person and see what you have to say about our discipline of fingerprint comparisons. So thank you again for joining us for another week, and we'll talk to you again next week. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Have a good week.
Hey, everybody. Be sure to check out eliteforensicservices.com for upcoming training courses. We have great workshops and courses such as Advanced ACV Applications and Reducing Erroneous Exclusions. Go to www.eliteforensicservices.com today.